The morning of December 21st, 1944. The frozen forests south of Malmedy, Belgium. A German soldier crouched in his foxhole as American artillery began its morning barrage. He had survived 3 years of war on the Eastern Front, witnessed the destruction of entire divisions at Kursk, and endured countless bombardments. Nothing had prepared him for this. The shells were exploding above his head, not impacting the ground as they should, but detonating in midair with surgical precision 20 to 30 feet above the snow-covered earth, showering down a lethal rain of shrapnel that turned his foxhole into a death trap rather than a sanctuary. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed himself flat against the frozen dirt, feeling the hot fragments whistle past his helmet, watching men around him torn apart by steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once. That morning, examining an unexploded American shell in the pre-dawn darkness, Weber had seen something that defied his understanding of what was possible. The shell's nose contained what appeared to be a complete radio transmitter, roughly the size of a wine bottle, packed with miniature glass vacuum tubes. These delicate components had somehow survived being fired from a gun at forces that should have pulverized them into powder. Wehrmacht engineers had spent a decade concluding such a device was theoretically impossible. The Americans had not only built it, but were manufacturing them by the tens of thousands. This single realization would fundamentally alter German understanding of what America was capable of producing, and by extension, what Germany was facing. Yet the devastating truth that would haunt Weber and tens of thousands of German soldiers throughout the final months of the war was simpler and more terrifying. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German troops would discover they were being destroyed not by every American shell, but by a calculated pattern they could neither predict nor counter. American artillery batteries were firing a deliberate mixture. Roughly 1 in every 5 shells carried the proximity fuse. The other 4 were conventional high-explosive rounds with impact or timed fuses, designed to crater the ground and destroy fortifications. This ratio was no accident. It was a calculated doctrine born from months of tactical analysis. The conventional shells forced German soldiers to take cover in foxholes, trenches, and bunkers. The proximity-fused shells, detonating overhead at precisely calibrated heights, killed the men hiding in those supposedly safe positions. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers could not predict which shells would explode on impact and which would detonate above them. Every incoming barrage became a lottery of death. Taking cover meant potential safety from impact rounds but guaranteed exposure to the airbursts. Remaining exposed might save you from the airbursts but meant certain death from the conventional shells. There was no tactical solution. No defensive position offered protection. No amount of experience or training could predict the pattern. The Wehrmacht, which had perfected combined arms warfare and prided itself on tactical sophistication, discovered it was fighting an enemy that had industrialized probability itself. The story of how German soldiers came to witness and fear this killing pattern began not in the forests of Belgium, but in the laboratories and factories of the United States, where in the summer of 1940, a group of American scientists were tasked with solving what every major power had concluded was an impossible problem. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists and engineers under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Among them was Merle Tuve, a physicist whose brilliant but volatile temperament would drive a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The problem they faced was straightforward to state but seemingly impossible to solve. German and Japanese aircraft were decimating Allied ships and ground forces. Conventional anti-aircraft guns required either a direct hit, which was extraordinarily difficult against a maneuvering target traveling at 300 miles per hour, or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined altitude. In practice, at the start of the war, it required approximately 20,000 shells to down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ranged as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. The concept of a proximity fuse had been considered for decades. Make a fuse that could detect when it approached a target and detonate automatically. Simple in theory, impossible in practice given the technology of the 1930s. Germany had explored proximity fuses as early as 1930, developing over 30 different designs, including acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise and electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces. By 1939, German researchers had concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties, though Rheinmetall Borsig would resume limited work in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The British had reached further. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using a small Doppler radar system. They tested prototypes on rockets, which faced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. But Britain's program was stymied by two critical obstacles. The cost was astronomical, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking. More fundamentally, they could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still far too delicate to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. The British shared their research through the Tizard mission when America entered the war, but it would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work. The Americans took the British research and did what no other nation could. They actually built it. Not a laboratory curiosity, but a mass-produced weapon that could be manufactured by the millions. Tuvey's Section T at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, established on March 10, 1942, in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was elegant. Making it work was another matter entirely. Consider the engineering challenges. The fuse had to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. Inside this space, engineers had to fit a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All of this had to function in extreme temperatures and survive storage for months. Most daunting of all, it had to withstand the shock of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. Every component experiences a crushing force equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel. And after surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as a founding member, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were designed for the Raytheon, gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up, and they were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%. But vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries were too large and had limited shelf life, particularly in tropical heat. Engineers developed a reserve battery that used a liquid electrolyte, kept separate from the battery plates until activation. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This gave the batteries indefinite storage life. The fuse needed multiple safety mechanisms. It could not arm until well clear of the gun. It required protection against accidental detonation from radio interference or the ship's own radar. It needed wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water. Each safety feature added complexity. By the time development was complete, each proximity fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. The Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun was 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The target was 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, downing these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of shots. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 bursts on the first day of testing. The Navy immediately cancelled the remainder of the scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin. 5 companies were selected to manufacture the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production started slowly. By the end of 1942, factories were producing 500 fuses per day, but American industrial capacity was just warming up. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 5,259,113 fuses, representing 24% of total production. The company employed 10,000 workers operating continuously, 7 days a week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts, produced even more, manufacturing 5,683,332 fuses, while also producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used across the program. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the intricate components under conditions of absolute secrecy. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were searched entering and leaving the facilities. They did not know what they were building. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading code name VT fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. The very existence of the fuse was classified. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where there was no chance of a dud falling into enemy hands. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese Aichi D-3. Dive bombers attacked a U.S. Navy task force. As the aircraft broke off their attack, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the cruiser USS Helena, fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the departing bombers. All 3 shells exploded near one of the aircraft, shredding it with shrapnel. the aircraft plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would have required dozens of conventional shells. They had downed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit. Word of the success spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor. Combat results exceeded every prediction. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only 25% of shells fired. Admiral Arleigh Burke, later Chief of Naval Operations, recalled that when he served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. The true effectiveness was demonstrated in a kamikaze attack on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. Two destroyers, USS Hadley and USS Hugh W. Hadley, came under assault from approximately 150 Japanese aircraft during Operation Kikusui No. 6, many loaded with explosives and intent on suicide runs. During approximately 1 hour and 25 minutes of intense combat, the two destroyers and 4 support craft faced overwhelming odds. Hadley knocked down 23 enemy planes before being hit by 1 bomb, 3 kamikazes, and 1 Oka rocket bomb. Hugh W. Hadley accounted for additional aircraft before being hit 4 times by suicide planes and left dead in the water. Both ships survived despite catastrophic damage. The verdict on proximity-fused ammunition in this action was indispensable. But for most of the war, the Pentagon strictly forbade use of the fuse over land. The risk was too great that a dud shell would fall into enemy hands. German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. If Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, intelligence analysts estimated bomber losses could increase by 300%. The strategic air campaign might become impossible, so the fuses were used only over water, where dud shells would sink beyond enemy reach. When a dud proximity-fused shell landed on Sicily during the invasion in July 1943, headquarters dispatched a special patrol to recover it before German forces could find it. This absolute security restriction began to crack in June 1944, when Germany unleashed the Vosne flying bomb against London. Launched from sites across the English Channel, the V-1s approached at speeds of 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters. Small, fast, and arriving without warning, they were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. From June to late August 1944, Germany launched over 9,000 V-1s against Britain. The pilotless missiles inflicted tens of thousands of civilian casualties. British defences initially could destroy only 17% of the V-1s that entered the coastal gunbelt. The situation was desperate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorised use of proximity fuses in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain. Modified fuses were rushed into production, specifically calibrated for the small, fast V-1s. British and American anti-aircraft guns along the coast were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, working in conjunction with new radar systems and fire control computers. The effect was dramatic. Within 4 weeks, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. During one day in late August, 82% of incoming V-1s were shot down. Churchill later stated that the proximity fuse made possible the successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining. The Vosne campaign demonstrated beyond doubt that the proximity fuse was war-winning technology, but it also meant the secret was partially compromised. Thousands of fuses were being fired over land. The risk that seemed so unacceptable in 1943 now had to be weighed against military necessity. In December 1944, that calculation changed completely. On the morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West. The Germans struck through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive took the Allies by complete surprise. Within days, German forces had driven a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. The weather was terrible, with heavy snow and thick clouds that grounded Allied air power. German commanders felt safe from artillery fire because poor visibility made accurate observation nearly impossible. They were wrong. On December 16th, the same day the offensive began, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelsson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, faced an agonizing decision. German forces were assaulting the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau. The lightly armed cavalry desperately needed artillery support. Axelsson had just received a new type of ammunition, proximity-fused shells, codenamed POSIT. But Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not yet authorized their use over land. The secrecy restrictions were still technically in place. Axelsson decided the emergency trumped the restrictions. He ordered his gunners to fire the proximity-fused shells. The effect on German forces was devastating. For the first time in the European theatre, American artillery was firing airbursts with perfect consistency, regardless of visibility or terrain. Each shell exploded 20 to 50 feet above the ground, precisely calibrated for maximum effect against personnel. The fragments spread in a cone-shaped pattern that covered an area far larger than a ground burst. Foxholes provided no protection. The shrapnel rained down from above, penetrating even log-reinforced bunkers. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front had never experienced anything like it. They could not hear the shells approaching due to the high velocity. The first warning was the explosion overhead. On December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction. On December 21st, all limits were lifted. But here the story takes a turn that German soldiers would find even more psychologically devastating than the airbursts themselves. American artillery doctrine did not call for every shell to carry a proximity fuse. The tactical manuals specified a deliberate mixture. For anti-personnel fire missions, American batteries were instructed to load approximately 20% of their shells with proximity fuses and 80% with conventional impact or timed fuses. This ratio was the result of extensive testing and analysis. Fire 1 proximity-fused shell, then 4 conventional shells. Repeat the pattern. The conventional shells served multiple purposes. They cratered the ground, destroyed fortifications, cut communication wires, and most importantly, forced enemy soldiers to seek cover. The proximity-fused shells then killed those soldiers in their cover. From a German soldier's perspective, the pattern was undetectable and therefore unpredictable. Standing in formation during a barrage meant certain death from conventional shells. Diving into a foxhole might save you from the impact rounds, but left you completely exposed to the airbursts that detonated overhead with no warning. Deep bunkers offered no advantage. The shrapnel came straight down through log roofs that were designed to protect against horizontal shell fragments. Trees provided no cover. In fact, proximity-fused shells detonating above the forest canopy created additional fragmentation as they shattered tree trunks and sent wooden splinters raining down alongside the steel shrapnel. One American artillery officer, surveying a position after a proximity-fused barrage, noted that the forest appeared to have been topped by the sweep of a giant scythe. Tree trunks were shattered and torn. Almost every tree was severed about 40 feet from the ground. Klaus Weber, the German soldier who had examined the unexploded shell that morning, would survive the war and decades later describe his experience to American historians conducting oral history interviews with former Wehrmacht personnel. The airbursts were terrifying, he recalled, but what broke us, psychologically, was the randomness. You could not predict which shells would explode on impact and which would burst above you. Every barrage became impossible to survive through anything except pure chance. It was like being forced to play Russian roulette continuously. Your skills meant nothing. Your experience meant nothing. You simply waited to discover whether the next shell would let you live. Weber described watching a veteran sergeant, a man who had survived 4 years of warfare, including Stalingrad, simply refused to leave his bunker during an American barrage. The sergeant had calculated, correctly, that remaining in cover gave him perhaps a 20% chance of being killed by an airburst, while leaving cover gave him a near certainty of being killed by the impact rounds. But refusing to move meant the unit could not maneuver, could not advance, could not even retreat effectively. The Americans had created a tactical paralysis. Another German prisoner, interviewed by American intelligence officers in January 1945, put it more bluntly: "Your artillery has removed courage from warfare. A brave man and a coward have exactly the same chance of survival under your airbursts. This is not honorable combat. This is industrialized slaughter. The Wehrmacht prides itself on individual valor and tactical skill. You have made both irrelevant." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 6 weeks, 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells were fired in the European theatre. The impact on German forces was immediate and catastrophic. Lieutenant General George Patton later wrote to the War Department describing an action near the Sauer River. His Third Army had caught a German battalion attempting to cross with a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused shells. By actual count, 702 enemy soldiers were killed. Patton wrote that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. He predicted that when all armies had this weapon, they would need to devise entirely new methods of warfare. He added, "With evident satisfaction, I am glad that you all thought of it first." The morning of December 21st saw proximity fuses used in defense of Malmedy itself. SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150, part of the elaborate German deception operation, attacked the town at approximately 4:30 in the morning. American artillery battalions supporting the defense fired proximity-fused shells with devastating effect. The airbursts so unnerved the attackers that some charged directly into American positions, seeking any shelter from the overhead explosions. The attack was repelled by afternoon, but the tactical impact went beyond the immediate casualties. German units began exhibiting what American intelligence officers termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the helplessness of facing proximity-fused fire mixed with conventional rounds. Forward observers reported that some German units were refusing orders to move during American artillery fire. Junior officers were unable to command their men forward. Experienced non-commissioned officers, who had led troops through years of brutal combat, were openly stating they could see no tactical solution to the American barrage patterns. The Wehrmacht had spent years developing infantry tactics based on fire and movement. Small unit leaders were trained to assess threats, identify covered approaches, and maneuver under fire. These skills had been honed through the campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. German small unit tactics were widely considered the finest in the world. None of it mattered against the mixed barrage pattern. Movement drew fire from the impact rounds. Staying in cover meant exposure to the airbursts. There was no tactical decision a junior officer could make that improved his unit's chances of survival. The only variable was luck. American intelligence reports from late December 1944 noted a dramatic shift in German prisoner interrogations. In earlier years of the war, captured Wehrmacht soldiers had typically expressed confidence in German equipment, training, and leadership, even when acknowledging that Allied material superiority was overwhelming. By January 1945, prisoners were expressing a fundamentally different assessment. They were not simply acknowledging American advantages in numbers or industrial capacity. They were describing a kind of warfare they could not comprehend and therefore could not counter. One German artillery officer, captured in mid-January during the reduction of the Bulge, provided a particularly detailed analysis during his interrogation. The officer, a career soldier who had commanded batteries in Russia and Italy before being transferred to the Western Front, began by acknowledging that German forces had always understood American material superiority. "We knew you had more shells than us," he stated through an interpreter. "We knew your logistics were better. We knew your artillery could fire more rounds per hour than ours. These were quantitative advantages. We could adapt to them through superior tactical positioning, through mobility, through the superior training of our officers. But your proximity fuse represents something different. It is not a quantitative advantage, it is a qualitative transformation. You have found a way to make every shell more lethal without firing more shells. You have automated precision that previously required skilled forward observers and perfect timing. And by mixing these shells with conventional rounds in a pattern we cannot predict, you have created a situation where no amount of German tactical skill makes any difference. The officer paused, then continued with what American intelligence analysts noted was a tone not of anger, but of exhausted resignation. In Russia, we developed tactics to counter Soviet artillery. The Russians would fire massive barrages, but they were predictable. They concentrated fire on obvious targets. We learned to disperse, to use dummy positions, to move immediately after being spotted. Against British artillery in Africa and Italy, we learned different techniques. The British used precisely timed and targeted fire, but it followed observable patterns. We could predict where they would shoot next based on where they had shot before. Against your artillery, there is nothing to predict. The shells that explode on impact train us to take cover. The shells that explode overhead punish us for taking cover. The mixture means we cannot develop a tactical response. We can only endure and hope the barrage ends before we are hit. American interrogators pressed him on whether German forces had developed any effective counters. The officer shook his head. Some units tried extreme dispersion, spreading out to the point where we lost tactical cohesion. This reduced casualties per barrage but made coordinated operations impossible. Other units tried staying constantly mobile, never remaining in position long enough for your artillery to target them. This exhausted the men and used fuel we didn't have. Some commanders tried digging deeper bunkers, but the airbursts penetrate anything except reinforced concrete, and we lack the resources to build concrete positions everywhere. There is no solution. We simply accept that when your artillery fires, a calculable percentage of our men will die, and there is nothing we can do to improve their odds. The psychological impact was measured in concrete military indicators. Desertion rates among German units facing American artillery increased dramatically in January and February 1945. These were not mass surrenders of demoralized units, but individual soldiers and small groups simply walking away from their positions during or immediately after artillery barrages. Self-inflicted wounds, the desperate act of soldiers shooting themselves in the foot or hand to get evacuated from combat, increased noticeably among units that had been subjected to repeated proximity-fused barrages. Medical officers at German field hospitals reported treating soldiers for what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction, but which German military doctors at the time diagnosed as cardiac problems or nervous exhaustion. The symptoms were consistent. Soldiers who had functioned normally under conventional artillery fire, who had endured the brutal combat of the Eastern Front, were experiencing uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, and panic responses when they heard any distant explosion. American artillery forward observers, monitoring German positions through binoculars and spotting scopes, reported observable changes in German behavior patterns after just 2 or 3 days of mixed proximity and conventional fire. German soldiers stopped using standard tactical movements. Instead of moving in organized groups from covered position to covered position, they moved individually and erratically, like frightened animals. This pattern, which observers initially attributed to general demoralization, was actually a rational adaptation to unpredictable artillery. By moving individually and randomly, soldiers reduced the chances that a single proximity burst would kill multiple men. But this adaptation destroyed military effectiveness. Squads could not maneuver as units. Platoons could not execute coordinated attacks. Companies lost cohesion. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered combined arms tactics and small unit initiative, was being reduced to a collection of individuals trying to survive, rather than an organized military force trying to achieve objectives. German commanders attempting to mount offensives or even organized withdrawals found their orders increasingly ignored or executed with such hesitancy that tactical opportunities disappeared. A company commander might order an attack, but his platoons would advance so slowly and cautiously, so obsessed with avoiding American artillery, that the attack achieved nothing. A battalion commander might order a retreat to new defensive positions, but units would scatter during movement rather than maintain formation, arriving at the new position degraded and disorganized. Senior German officers, reviewing after-action reports and casualty statistics in late January 1945, identified the proximity fuse as a crisis requiring immediate response. Wehrmacht ordnance experts were ordered to examine any unexploded American shells that could be recovered. Technical intelligence units were tasked with determining how the fuse worked and whether countermeasures were possible. The problem was that by the time Germany prioritized this analysis, almost no intact proximity fuses could be found. The fuses had a reliability rate above 90% by late 1944. Of the shells that did fail to detonate, most buried themselves in soft ground or snow, making recovery difficult. The few that could be examined revealed a level of miniaturization and manufacturing precision that German experts found difficult to believe. One German ordnance officer's report, captured by American forces in March 1945, described examining a damaged but partially intact proximity fuse. The report noted that the fuse contained vacuum tubes smaller than any German manufacturer could produce reliably. Electronic components assembled with a precision suggesting automated rather than hand assembly, and overall construction that implied a manufacturing infrastructure orders of magnitude beyond Germany's capacity. The officer concluded that even if Germany had complete technical specifications for the fuse, which they did not, German industry lacked the capacity to produce them in militarily significant quantities. More fundamentally, he noted, Germany lacked the economic reserves to invest billions of Reichsmarks in a single weapon system, while simultaneously trying to maintain production of tanks, aircraft, and basic ammunition. This analysis reached the highest levels of German military leadership and contributed to a growing recognition that the war was militarily unwinnable. It was not simply that Germany was outnumbered or outproduced, though both were true. It was that America was solving problems Germany had concluded were unsolvable, and doing so at industrial scale. During the final months of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, the use of proximity-fused artillery only intensified. From January through March 1945, American artillery expended hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells against German positions. The pattern remained the same, one proximity fuse to every 4 or 5 conventional rounds. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound, or rather the lack of sound, that preceded an airburst. High-velocity artillery shells travel faster than sound. You hear the explosion before you hear the shell coming. With conventional impact rounds, this meant you heard a sharp crack as the shell hit the ground, followed by the whistle of fragments. With proximity rounds, you heard a distinctly different sound, a sharper bang from above, followed immediately by the rain of shrapnel. Learning to distinguish these sounds gave you perhaps half a second of warning. It was never enough. Wehrmacht tactical manuals, hastily revised in February 1945, attempted to provide guidance for units facing American artillery. The instructions revealed the impossibility of the situation. Units were told to maintain dispersal while somehow remaining capable of coordinated action. Soldiers were instructed to seek cover that protected against both impact rounds and airbursts, a physical impossibility. Officers were directed to time movements between American barrages, but American artillery was firing continuously in many sectors, providing no safe intervals. The manuals included one instruction that American intelligence analysts found particularly revealing. German soldiers were told that if they observed an unexploded American shell, they should mark its location and report it immediately to ordnance disposal teams, but under no circumstances should they attempt to examine or move it. This instruction implicitly acknowledged that Germany desperately wanted intact proximity fuses for analysis, but also revealed that previous attempts to recover them had resulted in casualties. American engineers had included anti-handling devices in some proximity fuses, making them dangerous to examine even when they failed to detonate during handling. The final accounting of proximity fuse effectiveness came in the casualty statistics. German medical records, captured after the war, revealed that wounds from artillery increased significantly as a percentage of total casualties in early 1945. More importantly, the severity of those wounds changed. Proximity-fused shells, exploding overhead, created wound patterns distinctly different from conventional artillery. Shrapnel entered from above, striking heads, shoulders and backs rather than legs and lower bodies. Multiple fragment wounds became the norm rather than the exception. The mortality rate for soldiers wounded by proximity-fused artillery was significantly higher than for those wounded by conventional shells. By April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the proximity fuse had become so integrated into American artillery doctrine that its use was routine rather than exceptional. German forces facing the final Allied offensives were subjected to barrages where perhaps 1 in 3 shells now carried proximity fuses, an even higher ratio than the earlier 1 in 5 pattern. The psychological effect was complete. Wehrmacht units in the West were surrendering at unprecedented rates, with soldiers explicitly citing the impossibility of surviving American artillery as their reason for capitulation. The weapon that had seemed impossible to build had become the weapon that convinced German soldiers their cause was hopeless. American innovation had not just won battles, it had broken the will of an enemy that had believed itself tactically superior. The proximity fuse stood as testament to industrial might combined with scientific brilliance, proving that sometimes the most decisive victories come not from fighting harder, but from making the enemy's fighting impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.